USS Washington is about to do something no other American battleship does in the entire war. Sink an enemy battleship, alone, in the dark, with her guns. It is just past 11 o'clock, the night of November 14, 1942, in the black water off Guadalcanal the Americans call Ironbottom Sound. And the man steaming in to meet her, Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, does not know she is there. Kondo is the second most powerful commander in the Imperial Navy, behind only Yamamoto. Hours earlier, his floatplane found the American force in his path and sent back a count. 2 cruisers, 4 destroyers. He believed it, and he had every reason to. He had graduated first in his class of 172. He commanded the finest night lookouts on any ocean, and his ships carried the deadliest torpedo ever built. His heavy cruisers alone outweighed everything the floatplane had reported, so he turned in toward the island to finish the mission the last Japanese admiral had failed. The count was wrong. 2 of the shapes his floatplane logged as cruisers were battleships, Washington and South Dakota, the newest ships in the American fleet, 9 16-inch guns to a hull. And the taller of the 2 had already found Kondo's force in the dark and locked onto it, with something his lookouts could not see and could not answer. Within about 7 minutes of her opening fire, 1 Japanese battleship would be a burning wreck, with better than 200 of her crew dead, and Japan's last real chance to take back Guadalcanal would sink with her. Kondo trusted the best eyes on the ocean. The trouble was that the thing hunting him in the dark had stopped needing eyes at all. To understand why 1 battleship was worth an entire campaign that night, you have to know what men were dying for at Guadalcanal. Because the island meant nothing in itself. It was a strip of jungle in the southern Solomons that almost no one in America had heard of before the war. What gave it meaning was an airfield. In the summer of 1942, the Japanese began cutting a runway out of the jungle there, and American commanders understood a simple thing. Aircraft from that field could reach the sea lanes between America and Australia. Whoever held the strip held the sky over that corner of the Pacific. On the 7th of August, the United States Marines landed and took the half-built airfield, finished it, and named it Henderson Field. And then the thing both sides had really come for began. The Japanese needed the airfield back, and there was only one way to get it: land enough troops to storm it from the land side. But troops can only come by sea, and by day the sea was ruled by aircraft from that same Henderson Field. So reinforcements and bombardments had to come at night. That turned the campaign into a series of night sea battles, month after month, and the Japanese won almost all of them, because the dark was their element. By November of 1942, the tally of those nights ran against the Americans, and both sides understood the decision was close, and that it would come in the dark. To understand why Kondo trusted that count, you have to understand what the Imperial Japanese Navy had spent the previous 20 years becoming. Because by the autumn of 1942, the Japanese were, without much argument, the best night-fighting navy in the world. And they had earned that reputation the hard way. Where other navies treated darkness as the time to break off and wait for morning, the Japanese treated it as the moment to attack. And they had built their entire surface doctrine around a single conviction: that a well-drilled fleet could find, close, and destroy an enemy in the dark before that enemy ever understood what was happening to him. That conviction rested on 2 things, and the first of them was human. The Imperial Navy selected its lookouts the way other services selected pilots, testing thousands of men for night vision and picking the small number whose eyes worked best in near-total darkness. And then it trained them for years. These men learned to sweep the horizon in a slow, disciplined pattern that never let the eye settle and never let it strain. And they were issued optics that matched the effort: enormous pedestal-mounted night binoculars with lenses so large they could gather the faint light of stars, instruments that could pull a darkened ship out of the black at distances that seemed impossible to anyone who had not looked through them. A trained Japanese lookout on a clear night could sometimes make out an enemy hull before any Western Navy's instruments could. And in battle after battle in the Solomons, that edge had been decisive. The second thing was a weapon, and it was the finest of its kind that any Navy put to sea in the entire war. The Type 93 torpedo, which the Americans would later nickname the Long Lance, ran on pure oxygen instead of compressed air. And that one design choice gave it numbers that read almost like fiction. It carried a warhead of roughly 1,000 pounds. It could run to nearly 25 miles. It reached speeds no American torpedo could touch, and because it burned oxygen rather than air, it left almost no wake, which meant the first warning a target usually received was the explosion itself. It is worth stopping on why this weapon frightened the Americans so badly, because it was not only the numbers. It was that the Americans at first refused to believe it existed. When their cruisers began exploding and sinking in the early night battles of the Solomons, struck from an impossible distance, American staffs reached for any explanation but the correct one. They decided it was mines. They decided it was submarines. They drew charts of minefields that were not there and hunted for submarines that were not there, because to accept the truth meant accepting that the enemy had a torpedo with twice the reach of their own, and that every Japanese destroyer could kill a cruiser from a range at which it could not yet even be seen. The secret was oxygen. An ordinary torpedo carries a flask of compressed air to burn its fuel, but air is 4/5 useless nitrogen, which streams out the back in bubbles and leaves a telltale white wake. Japanese engineers learned to run on pure oxygen, and that did two things at once. The nitrogen stopped feeding the wake, and the fuel burned far more efficiently. Hence the nearly 25 miles of range, and the speed, and the absence of a trail. The price was danger. Pure oxygen under pressure aboard a warship is a bomb waiting for an excuse, and more than one Japanese crew died in training as they perfected the thing. But by 1942, they had perfected it, and it worked exactly as designed. Put those two things together, the eyes and the torpedo, and you have the machine that had been breaking Allied formations apart for months. And it had already proven itself more than once. On the night of the 9th of August, barely a day after the American landing, a Japanese cruiser force under Admiral Mikawa came down the strait past the screen and fell on the Allied cruisers off Savo Island. The action lasted about half an hour. When it ended, 4 Allied heavy cruisers were sinking or already gone. More than 1,000 sailors were dead, and the Japanese steamed away almost untouched. It was one of the worst open-water defeats in the history of the American Navy, and it was delivered in the dark, with those same eyes and those same torpedoes. At the end of November, there would be Tassafaronga, where the pattern repeated in even more humiliating form. 8 Japanese destroyers, caught in the act of unloading supplies, would turn and tear an American force of 5 cruisers and 6 destroyers apart with torpedoes alone, sinking 1 cruiser and gravely damaging 3 more, and again slip away barely scratched. Night after night, the same thing happened. The Japanese saw first, fired first, from a range no one expected, and were gone before the survivors could work out where the attack had come from. This was the enemy Willis Lee was steaming to meet that night, and this is why Kondo had not the slightest reason to doubt the outcome. And it is worth being precise about who Kondo was, because he was not a reckless man and he was not a fool. He had graduated at the very top of his class, he had served as a naval attaché in Britain, and had studied his eventual enemies at close range, and he was regarded inside the Imperial Navy as second in importance only to Yamamoto himself. In the war games before the war, when the Japanese rehearsed the opening moves of the conflict on tabletop and chart, Kondo had been given the role of the enemy commander, playing the British and the Americans against his own side, which tells you something about how highly his judgment was rated. He was careful, he was intelligent, and he understood the ocean he was fighting on as well as any man alive. The ship he was steaming to protect that night was a veteran named Kirishima, and she carried her own kind of contradiction. She had been laid down in 1912, before the First World War, as a battle cruiser, one of 4 sisters designed with help from a British naval architect in the years when Britain still built ships for Japan. She was old. She had been rebuilt twice between the wars, given thicker armor and new engines and enough speed to keep pace with the aircraft carriers she had spent the past year escorting. and those rebuilds had turned her into something the Japanese called a fast battleship. But underneath the modern superstructure, she was still a hull from another age, with an armor scheme designed against the shells of 1914. Her main guns were 14-inch, 8 of them, and they were good guns. On this particular night, though, they were loaded with the wrong ammunition. That detail matters, so hold on to it. Kirishima's mission was to bombard Henderson Field, the airfield on Guadalcanal that the Americans had taken and would not give back. And to smash an airfield, you do not use armor-piercing shells. You use high-explosive and incendiary rounds designed to crater runways and burn parked aircraft. Her magazines that night were full of exactly that. Type 3 incendiary shells, superb for setting an airfield on fire, close to useless against the armored hull of an enemy battleship. Kondo did not expect to meet an enemy battleship, so the loadout made perfect sense. It was the logical choice, right up until the moment it wasn't. Kondo's force came into the strait in several columns, the scouting ships ahead, Kirishima and the heavy cruisers behind, all of it moving through the dark as tightly and as confidently as only the Japanese could move. A few miles ahead, 6 American ships came on in one long single file, 4 destroyers, and behind them, the 2 battleships Kondo took for cruisers. They were commanded by Rear Admiral Willis Lee, and unlike Kondo, who was looking through the best optics on the ocean, Lee was looking at a screen. That difference is the whole of the night, so it is worth stopping on. Washington's radar did not need starlight, did not need a trained eye, and did not need the target to give itself away in any manner. It sent a pulse into the dark and listened for what came back. And what came back that night was Kondo's force, at a range of nearly 20,000 yards, long before the sharpest eye in the world could have made out anything at all. Lee saw the Japanese on his screen minutes before the Japanese suspected the American battleships even existed. And Lee was not merely an admiral who happened to be handed a radar. He was probably the only flag officer in the entire fleet who understood the machine better than the men who operated it. The first thing that happened that night was not gunfire. It was a mark on a screen. In Washington's combat station, the radar caught Kondo's ships at nearly 20,000 yards, minutes before any man on any of the ships could have seen a thing by eye. Lee watched the marks crawl slowly across the screen, resolve into a course and a speed, and held that picture in his head while the Japanese came on toward him, not yet suspecting they had already been found. He had a rare advantage for a commander. He knew where the enemy was, and the enemy did not know where he was. And he did not intend to waste that advantage on a hasty salvo. The temptation to fire was strong. The guns were ready, the range was closing, and somewhere ahead in the dark his destroyers were already entering the reach of the Japanese torpedoes. But Lee waited. He waited because he understood something almost no one around him understood. The radar gave him the right not to hurry. The eye demands that you fire while the target is visible, but the machine held the target continuously, in light and without light, and that changed the very meaning of patience. And so, when the fight ahead erupted and his destroyers began to die, Lee did not charge blindly to the rescue. He held Washington in the dark and waited for the picture to become so clear that a miss would be impossible. It is worth imagining what the radar looked like from the inside of Washington, because radar in 1942 was not a picture, but the work of men. In the Combat Information Center, a cramped, darkened space deep in the hull, operators sat at screens where returning pulses flared as greenish marks, and every mark had to be identified, tracked, and turned into numbers. Range, bearing, speed. Those numbers went to the gunnery officers, who fed them into a computer, a mechanical device the size of a cabinet that worked out where the shells would land given the motion of both ships, the wind, the spin of the earth, the wear on the barrels. Out of that came a firing angle, and the turrets swung on their own, obeying a solution reached by men who had never once seen the target with their eyes. Lee moved between the center and the bridge and read that picture the way few men in his fleet could. He did not crowd the operators, and he did not rush them. He understood the limits of their machine better than they did. where the radar was reliable, where it would throw a false mark from a nearby shore, where it would lose a target against a burning ship. And so, when the picture turned confused in the first minutes, when friendly and enemy marks blurred together, Lee did not fire blind. He waited for the clarity the radar could give, and the eye could not. The destroyers met first, and for the Americans it went badly. It is worth naming these ships because in the minutes that are so easy to sum up in a single line, hundreds of men died. Leading was Walk, then Benham, Preston, and Gwynn. The Japanese scouting ships caught them first, and Preston took concentrated fire. Shells smashed both her funnels, opened her engine room, and the ship came to a stop, wrapped in flame. She sank in a matter of minutes, taking 117 men with her, including her captain, who stayed on the bridge. Almost in the same moment, a torpedo struck Walk beneath her forward magazine, and the detonation tore off her entire bow. She went down so fast that part of her crew was dragged under with her, and there her own depth charges exploded, killing men who were already in the water. About 80 men from Walk did not come back. Benham, her bow blown off, still floated and drew slowly out of the fight, to sink later that same night. Her people were taken off. Gwynn took a hit in her engine room but stayed underway. In a few minutes, 4 ships of Lee's screen had ceased to exist as a fighting force, and it had all happened exactly to the Japanese design, the blow out of the dark before the victim could bring her guns to bear. For anyone keeping the count, the night so far was running precisely to Kondo's Doctrine. And here the night nearly turned into a catastrophe for the Americans, because the second battleship in Lee's line, South Dakota, chose the worst possible moment to break down. What happened to her deserves a closer look, because her trouble was not an enemy hit but her own machinery at the worst moment. Shortly before, in balancing her electrical load, the crew had tied down the protection on one of her generators, and when the circuit ran away, the failures cascaded, one after another, knocking out distribution boards all over the ship. In a few seconds, South Dakota lost her radars, her fire control, her radio, and part of her power. The newest battleship in the American fleet, packed with electronics, went blind and deaf and mute in the middle of a night battle. And worst of all, it happened just as she was coming onto the most dangerous stretch. Then, a second misfortune arrived. Swerving to avoid the burning wreckage of her own destroyers, South Dakota let the light of their fires fall behind her and throw her silhouette into relief, her tall superstructure, her funnel, her turrets, turning her into a black target against an orange background. For a Japanese lookout with his optics, no better target could have been asked for. The blind ship had put herself in a shop window, and Kondo's whole force turned toward her. Kondo saw that silhouette, and his doctrine worked instantly. Searchlights snapped open, the optics caught the target, and nearly his whole force fell on South Dakota at once. In a few minutes, she took 27 hits. Shells wrecked her superstructure, set her upper decks on fire, and cleaned out what was left of her communications and control. 39 men died. And while this was happening, while Kondo watched his salvos tear at the blinded American ship, he was convinced he was looking at everything the enemy had left. He was staring at his one victim in the searchlight beams, and did not know that the second, far more dangerous ship had at that moment vanished into the dark, beyond the reach of his lights, and was already laying her guns on him. Because while Kondo's entire force was busy with South Dakota, Washington came on through the dark, untouched and unseen, her radar holding the Japanese ships the whole time. Lee had waited. He let Kondo's searchlights snap on, let the Japanese commit, let his radar close the range to a figure at which a miss was nearly impossible, less than 9,000 yards, and for 16-inch guns, that is point blank. And then Washington opened fire. This is where the real story of the night lies, and it is not that a new ship beat an old one. It is what let the new ship shoot at all. Kondo had everything that was supposed to decide a night battle. The best eyes, the best torpedoes, the best training, years of victories. Washington had one box with a spinning antenna that a Japanese lookout could not have made out if he had stared straight at it. The SG radar. Standard fitting on a new American battleship. No secret wonder weapon, no one-of-a-kind instrument. It was a production unit that Allied industry was already turning out by the hundreds, onto battleships, onto cruisers, onto destroyers, onto the escort ships that guarded the convoys. And in that lies the detail Kondo never saw that night, but which decided everything. His lookouts were selected out of thousands. Their eyes were a gift no factory could manufacture, a talent that ripened over years of training. And such men were few, and there was nothing to replace them with. The American radar did not need to be selected out of thousands. It needed to be built, and building was the one thing Allied industry did better than anyone alive. Japan set its best men against the machine. This was not a duel between two ships. This was a collision between two ways of waging war. The official reports of that night said little of this outright, but the arithmetic left no room for doubt. An eye, however perfect, was still an eye, and it needed at least some light. The machine needed no light at all, and in the moment Washington opened fire out of total darkness, with no searchlight, no star shell, no sign at all to give away the shooter, the whole 20-year edge of the Imperial Navy in night fighting was wiped out at a stroke. Because there is no answering what you cannot see and cannot reply to, however long you train the eye. If the mechanics of this, how one production line box wiped out the best men in the world, are the kind of thing worth staying for, subscribing helps the channel and means you won't miss the next story. What comes next is the 7 minutes the whole thing was for. When Washington opened fire, Kirishima was less than 9,000 yards off, brightly lit by her own searchlights, which she had switched on to fire at South Dakota, and had not the slightest idea that a second American battleship stood in the dark to the west of her. The first salvo of 9 16-inch guns straddled her almost at once, and then came another and another. On Kirishima's bridge, for the first seconds, no one understood what was happening. A moment ago, the whole force had been firing at a clearly visible target, the blinded South Dakota in the glare of the fires, and everything was going to the familiar pattern. And then, out of the darkness to the west, from where by every report there should have been nothing, came the first salvo. Not a single shell, not a ranging shot stretched over minutes. A full salvo of heavy guns, landing at once and on target, and behind it, without pause, a second. For the Japanese officers, it was almost impossible to make sense of in those seconds. Their lookouts, the best in the world, stared into that quarter and could not see the shooter. No searchlight reached out from there. No star shell rose. By everything they knew about night fighting, shooting like that was not possible. To hit in the dark, you first had to light the target, and whoever lit it gave himself away first. Yet here someone was firing out of pure darkness, showing nothing, and hitting to kill from the first salvo. They were looking straight at the source of their destruction and seeing absolutely nothing there. And in that incomprehension went the few seconds the ship did not have. By the time Kirishima understood that a second unseen battleship was working her over, there was nothing and no one left to answer with. What happened next took about 7 minutes. It is worth slowing them down because the whole of the battle fits inside them. When Washington opened fire at under 9,000 yards, her first full salvo was for ranging, but the radar had already given a range so exact that ranging was barely needed. The second salvo hit. After that, Washington fired steadily, salvo after salvo, each one carrying up to 9 armor-piercing shells, weighing more than a ton apiece, toward Kirishima. And between the main salvos, her 5-inch secondary battery lashed the older ship, holing the superstructure and sweeping the decks clear of everything alive. And here that hull laid down in 1912 spoke again. Kirishima's armor had been designed against the shells of the First World War, which pierced the outer plate and burst right there at the surface. The American armor-piercing shell of 1942 was built differently. With a delay fuse, it passed through the outer skin and exploded deep inside, among the machinery and the magazines. The thin outer armor of the old battleship did not stop these shells. It only armed their fuses at exactly the right instant, helping them do their work where the damage was fatal. Hits landed along her whole length. One jammed her rudder at 10 degrees, and Kirishima began to turn in helpless circles. Others opened compartments at the waterline, and water came in faster than it could be pumped out. In 7 minutes, a ship that had taken 30 years to build and rebuild twice was reduced to a doomed ruin by a man who had never once laid his guns on her by eye. Now remember the shells in her magazines. All that night, Kirishima's main battery had been loaded with incendiary rounds for an airfield, close to useless against armor. While Washington took her apart from the dark, her own guns carried nothing that could have answered a battleship, even if she had managed to lay them. A logical loadout, made for a mission no one meant to change, turned into a ship left disarmed in the decisive minutes against the one enemy she had not expected. By the end of those 7 minutes, Kirishima was burning along her whole length, answering only to her engines, and poorly at that, and rolling first onto one side and then the other, each roll heavier than the last. The fires were beaten down by nearly 2 in the morning, but the engine rooms had to be abandoned. Heat and smoke were being drawn down through her own ventilation. The light cruiser Nagara tried to take her in tow and could not. Her captain, Iwabuchi, sent divers down to the steering compartments, but they could not get through the sealed hatches. The ship was doomed, and all that was left was to take off her people. The taking off of Kirishima's men was done in darkness and haste because the ship was rolling from side to side, and no one knew how much longer she would last. The destroyers Asagumo, Teruzuki, and Samidare came right alongside the dying battleship, took men aboard, and pulled away, and did it again and again. The Japanese order of abandoning ship was kept here too, as far as the situation allowed. First, the portrait of the emperor was taken off, then the wounded, then the rest by division. There was a logic in that ritual, for a navy to which form and duty meant no less than survival. 1,098 men were taken off in time. 212 were not. Many of them stayed in flooded compartments and at jammed hatches the divers could never reach, and others had died in those 7 minutes, at the guns and in the stations, smashed by shells. At 23 minutes past 3 in the morning, about 7.5 miles northwest of Savo Island, Kirishima rolled onto her port side and went down by the bow, and the water closed over a hull that had been 30 years in the building and rebuilding. Her captain, Iwabuchi, survived. 3 years later, he would die at Manila, but that is another story. Here, it is worth being precise because the sources disagree. By one account, traced to a post-war interrogation of one of her officers, Kirishima was deliberately scuttled by her crew. By a later technical study of her loss, there may have been no formal scuttling order at all, and the ship capsized on her own from a loss of stability. And the suddenness of that capsize caught even her captain off guard, who survived only by luck. Speculation. The exact circumstances of her final minutes, deliberate scuttling or spontaneous capsize, remain in dispute. What is not in dispute is the cause. By the time the question of how to abandon her arose, everything had already been decided by those 7 minutes in the dark, and Washington simply ceased fire and drew off into the dark she had come from. She had not taken a single hit in the whole battle. The only American battleship to sink an enemy battleship by gunfire in a straight duel in the entire war came out of it without a scratch and without a single man dead aboard. In that was the whole asymmetry of the night, reduced to one line. One side lost a battleship, 4 destroyers, and hundreds of men. The other drew off untouched because it could see in the dark what no one across from it could see. In the morning, wreckage and oil floated over the battle site, and the Americans rescued from the destroyers and the Japanese rescued from Kirishima found themselves in the same black water they had taken to calling Ironbottom Sound. The only difference was whose strategy had gone down to that bottom along with the ships. To measure what was actually decided that night, it is worth following what did not happen afterward. Kondo called off the bombardment of Henderson Field, And without the bombardment and without cover, the transports carrying reinforcements were left defenseless. 11 ships loaded with troops and supplies for the army on Guadalcanal. The next day, aircraft from that same surviving airfield and naval gunfire methodically destroyed them on their approach to the island. Of a whole division of reinforcements, only a few hundred soldiers reached the beach, with almost no heavy equipment, without most of their food and ammunition. The assault the whole operation had been for was made impossible before it began. And from there, it compounded. After that night, the Imperial Navy drew its lesson and never again sent heavy ships to Guadalcanal, limiting itself to fast night runs by destroyers that could bring in a little rice in barrels, but could not turn the campaign. The Japanese army on the island began to starve. The soldiers called Guadalcanal the Island of Death, and more of them died of hunger and disease there than fell in battle. In February of 1943, the Japanese secretly lifted off by night the men who could still stand and left the island. The advance across the Pacific that would end 2.5 years later in Tokyo Bay began here, on this strip of jungle, and one of the reasons it could begin at all was that production line box with an antenna that could see in the dark where the best eyes in the world saw nothing. The man who commanded that night was named Willis Lee, and he was perhaps the most unusual admiral in the American Navy. He grew up in Kentucky, learned to shoot as a boy, and turned out to be so gifted at it that he made the Olympic team. At the Games of 1920 in Antwerp, he won 5 gold medals, 7 awards in all, a result that would stand in the shooting sport for 60 years. But it was not the marksmanship itself that mattered. It was how he thought about it. Lee understood a hit as a problem of calculation, correction for wind, for range, for the tremor of the hand, for everything that stands between the barrel and the target. He saw the shot as an equation long before the Navy gave him an instrument that solved that equation by machine. Because of that cast of mind, Lee was drawn all his career to the technology others thought secondary. He worked on guns and fire control, dug into new instruments, and when radar appeared, he grasped its meaning earlier than almost any of his contemporaries. They said of him that he knew more about radar than the operators who worked it, and that was not a flourish for effect. He really would sit down at a screen, work out what it showed and what it did not, and hold in his head an exact picture of the machine's limits. By November of 1942, the Navy had finally given such a man a battleship with a good radar and sent him into the dark against the best night navy in the world. Few pairings of man and moment in that war were luckier. And here is the bitter precision of his fate. Lee won the night battle by seeing what the eye could not see. But the very machine war he helped bring on wiped out not only the Japanese optics, it wiped out his own trade as well. The age of the battleship, whose guns he understood better than anyone, was ending, and carriers and aircraft were coming in its place. By the end of the war, Lee understood this. He wrote that there would likely be little place left for a battleship admiral in the post-war Navy. He spent his last months not at the great guns, but at the head of a group searching for a way to defend against the kamikaze, the new weapon of a new war. He did not live to see how it all ended. On the 25th of August, 1945, 10 days after Japan surrendered, Willis Lee died of a heart attack in a launch carrying him out to his flagship, the old gunnery training ship Wyoming, in the harbor at Portland, Maine. He said he regretted only one thing, that he had not been present at the surrender he had given 3 years in the Pacific to bring about. The man who had seen the future of naval war before his enemy did, passed at the very moment that future arrived, and the profession that had made him without equal was passing along with him. And what of Kondo? He survived the night and survived the war. After Guadalcanal, he was quietly eased out of seagoing commands, tainted by the failures, but by the customs of the Imperial Navy, not punished in the open. He would still receive full admiral's rank, would command a fleet in China, would sit on the Supreme War Council. And at the very end, fate arranged one last irony. The man who before the war had been called an officer of the British type, who had played the enemy in the war games, would in 1945 in Indochina operate under the command of the British, his recent enemies. He would live until 1953 and become a successful businessman. He lost that night at Ironbottom Sound, not because he was the lesser man. His eyes really were the best on the ocean. That is the whole of it. The best eyes on the ocean are still only eyes, and the thing that came out of the dark to meet him had stopped asking for eyes at all. If this story was worth something to you, leave a like and subscribe. That is how the channel grows, and how you won't miss the next one. And there are many more stories like this one to come.